I don't know how it started. Maybe I was crying out with the sharpness of the pain or something, although I was increasingly practised in the art of never showing my despair or losing what I hoped was an inscrutable demeanour. Maybe this made him try even harder to unsettle me. Who knows? I mentioned earlier about Ken's predilection with large white hankies. They were an important part of his outfit, and he always had one in his pocket. They were always ironed, folded, and put away neatly. One memorable night he selected one from the pile, telling me it was really special. I hadn't a clue what he was talking about, but I quickly found out. He bound my unresisting body hand and foot, and to my utter repellence he stuffed the hanky into my mouth, little by little. I began to gag, and my eyes ran with tears. I could do nothing but try to expel it. Annoyed that I had opposed him, he pushed it back in rather roughly, and he was obviously not quite happy with the result, as he told me to wait a minute. Well, I was a captive audience, while he went to fetch something. It seemed an interminable wait, and I was morbidly curious to see what he had in his hands. It was a giant sticking plaster, one of those huge ones you get in a variety pack. He pulled off the paper and gently stuck it around my mouth. It effectively sealed the hanky inside my mouth. Does this surprise you? I was utterly desolate as I lay there, my eyes following his every movement. I really and truly believed that I had experienced the very worst it could be. It was almost impossible to comprehend. He was a madman, or was he? Everything was meticulously planned. I could never fault his logic. As far as I knew, he wasn't suffering from delusions or voices in his head. I'm sure that if he was, he would have told me something about it. "Come on," was all he'd say. "What's wrong with you? You're the odd one out. Lots of women like this." I was a little naive, certainly not a woman of the world, but I still could not believe his statement. It just didn't feel right. The interesting thing was I never came across any porn magazines or anything that might determine that his behaviour toward me gave him sexual gratification. So how did he know that lots of women enjoyed it? He hadn't even had a serious girlfriend by the age of 27 when he first met me. He let me get used to the sticking plaster first. It obviously pleased him, and he would, again, spend time just watching me from a vantage point on the bed somewhere. Apart from this searing pain in my joints, I began to experience queasiness and had to learn very quickly how to stop myself being sick because, well, I can't even imagine what would have happened if I couldn't get into the right position to be sick, and even worse, the positioning of the hanky and sticking plaster would have meant that I would have inhaled my own vomit. Not a nice thought. They were big tonsil-tickling hankies that dried my mouth and tongue and made it feel uncomfortably dry. I had to work hard to manufacture saliva, and while Ken gazed at me, I would surreptitiously gather as much moisture as I could on the tip of my tongue, and with small, hardly discernible darting movements start loosening the plaster's grip with my tongue. I had to make myself an emergency air hole. Why, I hear you ask? Tears are rolling down my cheek as I try to answer your unspoken question. Ken, my beloved and faithful husband, had a new game. My heart's racing, and I am beginning to feel sick and breathless. How powerful these memories are proving to be. I needed an air hole because Ken, having trussed me up like a chicken, quietening me with the old hanky and sticky plaster routine, played the ultimate game. He would delicately but firmly pinch the end of my nose, with the accompanying words, "Let's see how long you last," and adding something to the effect that he believed I could last for about 2 minutes before losing consciousness. Resisting was fruitless, as he would tighten his grip. I don't actually know for how long he would stop me breathing in terms of minutes, but I never lost consciousness, so presumably he didn't actually wish to dispose of me. I was more in danger of losing consciousness from the paralysing fear that gripped me. Now do you see why I needed an emergency air hole? I have to say I only ever made a tiny break in the seal of the sticking plaster, as he would have noticed a larger one, so the amount of air I could pull through such a small opening was hard fought. He never seemed to hide the sticking plasters, but always seemed to have a ready supply. The handkerchiefs were always there, stacked neatly and invitingly in the airing cupboard. The very handkerchiefs that I had desnotted, scrubbed and ironed with such care. Our life rumbled on. We bought a brand new car, had some nice holidays, and were always out and about exploring antiquities around the country. It was fun driving round in the open-top vintage car. It was very fast, and he enjoyed speed and danger. We also changed the catamaran for a wooden dinghy, and we often went out on one tide and stayed out exploring the Monmouthshire coast until the next flood tide came in. However, I couldn't fully relax, surrounded by the infrastructure of ropes, inexplicably called sheets in yacht speak. Where I was a coward, Ken was a spirited sailor, and I'm sure that his seamanship was enhanced by the knots he had perfected on his life model. We had 2 cats, and Ken would play with them lovingly and gently. They were the cornerstone of our life, and the question of children never ever arose. Again, I hadn't the faintest idea how we avoided the question, so what did we speak about? I still had a healthy respect for his intellect, humour, abilities, and general joie de vivre that seemed to be getting more and more ebullient as time went on. I was going downhill. Ken's treats could stop without warning, and equally start without preamble. I never knew where I was with him. The longest gap between tyings up was 2 months, and the most he had subjected me to were 3 in one night. Once he started to restrict my breathing, I began having palpitations and couldn't fully concentrate on my job. I had changed it again, and by now I was a public relations officer for a large packaging company. I was terrified of what he could do to me, and I didn't want to die. But I never let him see, never pleaded for my life. He began to get rougher and rougher. Can you imagine being tied, bound and gagged, and being literally thrown onto the bed? Not only that, but, in the days before duvets, he would throw the bedclothes on top of me and then sit on me. It was dark and airless in there, but at least I could covertly try and breathe a bit through the plaster. This became the usual way he tortured me. Tortured sounds such a strong word for it, and I have never used it before this time, strange as that may seem. What a legacy! I'm terrified of the dark. I'm terrified of enclosed spaces. I'm terrified of having a cold and not being able to breathe properly. I've never been able to smoke because of airflow restriction. I admire anyone who can. It was about this time I decided to pluck up courage to go and see the doctor. I cried and babbled as little as I could, but emotions were quite near the surface. I gave him only the edited highlights. His face gave away little, his words even less. He decided to palm me off onto his health visitor, who simply could not, would not, or was not equipped to help. Their complete lack of bedside manner made me feel as though I was the pervert, getting some sort of weird thrill from exposing myself in this very public way. I felt tainted and tatty. They gave me some tranquilizers to go away. I really hope that things are different these days. The tranquilizers slowed me down, and I enjoyed the effect of taking more than the prescribed dose, the feeling of everything floating. But I'm not sure they helped, just numbed a little bit. I just learned techniques of how to cope better, how to become even more self-reliant. After all, there was no one to whom I could unburden myself. I was living on a knife edge. The word knife edge took on a sinister reality. Ken expanded his repertoire to include a heavy-duty chain and a padlock that he produced on my birthday, March the 23rd. He was a reasonably generous man, and I craned my neck to see what my present was. I don't know whether I can adequately describe what I felt when my eyes rested upon his gift. He told me he'd been wondering what to get me, and had bought this from the local hardware shop. "Shall we try it now or later?" I remember him asking. It was heavy and cold, and it dug into me, but a saving grace was that I wasn't gagged this time. Obviously he was preoccupied with the novelty of the chain, and he would always save it for a special occasion. Weeks elapsed, even months. I can't remember with any clarity, and am still amazed that, now prompted, I can remember other incidents as though they were yesterday. He wanted to try something new, he said. He was terse and angry, and even now, as my brain seeks early closure on this particular incident, I still cannot comprehend what caused it. I was reasonably intuitive, though not as finely tuned as I am now, and my every waking hour seemed to revolve around preserving Ken's status quo. My senses on red alert the moment something altered. I wasn't bossy, I never lost my temper. My only crime was passivity. Such is the power of these thoughts that I have now got a sharp pain going from my right eye all the way up my head and down my neck. It's saying, "Stop now, haven't you recalled enough? No one's going to be interested in hearing such a pathetic story." This time I refuse to listen, and I must see this one through. It may have value for someone reading or listening to this, but it's certainly helping me. Ken was angry again. He bought several different kinds of rope and stumped up the stairs, dragging them behind him for ultimate effect. I hadn't really considered the metal loop on the loft hatch as my next tormentor. I'm sure his anger accounted for the superhuman strength he would need to grapple with my inert bound body, to position it to below the loft. He then somehow managed to thread the various ropes through the loop, and he began heaving me aloft. He didn't stop until I was dangling some 4 feet in the air, with legs and arms bearing the full brunt of my body weight. I was surprised that one or both of my slender little wrists didn't break under the strain. There I remained at his disposal for about half an hour, and I felt a real disgust as he ran his fingers along my quivering body. The wheals on my wrists and ankles were deeper than usual, and were still very evident the next day. I cried ferociously. I wondered whether there was any justice in the world. I wondered just how long I could go on for, because I seemed to be living in a permanent haze of aches, bruises and head pains. Because I was so upset, Ken allowed himself to show some remorse, and I was quite unprepared for the rush of compassion that I felt towards him. You want to believe so much when someone promises that they won't ever do it again, and for a while he didn't. But life soon settled down to the routine, familiar pattern of debasement. The mental torture for me was far worse than being physically hurt. One evening I found out something rather wonderful about physical pain. I think I will call it damage limitation. Something happened either subliminally or chemically that caused the pain threshold to be breached. But there it stayed. It didn't get any worse. Ken had used the African method, as I was to call it. Hands and feet bound separately, then coil upon coil of thick rope up and down my body. Thus I could, sort of, stand up. He was terse and said not a word to me, as he pushed and shoved me towards the stairs. I was gagged so I couldn't scream out. As I was poised sideways at the top of the stairs, I remember being so frightened of the unknown. It was what he didn't say that terrified me. Why? What had I done, and how could I stop it happening again? He punched me, a glancing blow in the stomach, and over I toppled. I bumped down 2 or 3 stairs, and he swung his leg, first one, then the other, kicking me down the rest until I ended up in an uncoordinated heap. There I stayed while he made himself a cup of something or other. My full weight bore down on whatever part of my anatomy that was underneath, so I couldn't move to get more comfortable. But, having braced myself for the very worst, I found out there was nothing after excruciating on the pain monitor. It numbed and allowed me to stay there, in what I can almost say was an altered state of consciousness. The bruises on my thighs and arms, particularly, were the worst I'd ever had. It has occurred to me many times, and I'd love to think that this was true, when I hear of those absolutely tragic cases of young girls being raped and murdered, that maybe during that time of extreme pain a similar switch may have been flicked in their brain to anaesthetise them too. The mental agony of waiting and watching I was never able to improve on, except that perhaps I developed more techniques to show Ken he hadn't hurt me that much. The thought of being a cringing, quivering wreck, a victim, was just too much for me to bear. But the defence mechanism into which I had put so much strategic energy may just have been my undoing.